I have told this account exactly once before, to the Colonial Survey Cooperative's Incident Review Board, on the morning after I surfaced from HFY's shelf. I told it in the same flat register I use for every post-dive debrief. The board chairman, a man named Orrin Falk, who had been reviewing survey reports for 30 years, took off his glasses 3 times in the space of 18 minutes, put them back on each time, without saying anything. When I finished, he asked me if I wanted water. I said I was fine. He said the board would need to reconvene. I said that was fine too. That was 14 months ago. I am telling it again now, because the cooperative's legal team has confirmed that the quarantine classification on Survey Sector 9 HFY has been lifted, and because I have been asked by 3 separate academic institutions to provide a first-person account for the public record. I have agreed, on the condition that I write it myself and that no one edits it before publication. I am a surveyor. I write survey reports. I know how to describe what I observed. I will tell you what I observed. I will also tell you one thing I have not told anyone else. Not the review board, not the cooperative's council, not the 2 oceanographers from the University of Celis who spent 4 days asking me careful questions over a shared table. I have not told anyone what the throne said, in full, and what I understood it to mean. The review board has the recording from my suit's sensor log. The audio of the throne's voice did not survive the compression codec. What is on record is a resonance signature and a 3-second acoustic anomaly that the cooperative's acoustic analysts classified as a structural settling event in the chamber wall. It was not a structural settling event in the chamber wall, but I will get to that. My name is Maravayan. At the time of the HFY's shelf descent, I was 31 years old. A grade 4 survey specialist for the Colonial Survey Cooperative with 11 years of field experience, 6 of them in deep ocean assignments. I held certifications in structural geological survey, pre-collapse architecture classification, and deep pressure submersible operation. I had logged more than 900 hours in the submersible designated Kiral, which I had operated since it was assigned to my division 3 years prior. I am telling you these things not to establish credentials, but because they matter to understanding what happened. The Vault of the Undivided had been visited before. 11 survey teams had descended to it over the course of 6 years. None of them had entered the primary chamber. I entered the primary chamber. Question the review board spent 4 sessions trying to answer was why, and I want to be precise about my answer, because the precise answer is not the obvious one. I entered the primary chamber because there was a crack in the wall. That is the full answer. There is nothing more strategic in it than that. HFY's shelf is a submerged geological plateau on the eastern seaboard of what the pre-collapse cartographers called the Carinian Basin. The collapse. The term refers here to the flooding sequence that began 1100 years ago and drowned approximately 63% of the world's land surface over the course of 2 centuries, left HFY's shelf under approximately 2,030 meters of water at its deepest survey point, and roughly 1,800 meters at the plateau's shallower western edge. The shelf is geologically active. There are 3 known fault systems running beneath it, all of them legacy structures from the same tectonic event sequence that accelerated the flooding in the 3rd phase of the collapse. The shelf moves, not dramatically, not dangerously by current standards, but it moves. The Vault of the Undivided was first charted by automated deep scan and survey, year 2003, when a routine bathymetric pass of the eastern shelf produced a return signature that the mapping algorithm flagged as a structural anomaly. The algorithm was correct. The anomaly was a building, a large one, 40 meters at its widest span, approximately 60 meters from base foundation, to the crown of what the first survey team's structural analyst identified as a primary vault. The building was pre-collapse. It hadn't built before the water came. It had been built, the dating survey confirmed, approximately 10,200 years before the water came. The architecture did not match any catalogued pre-collapse style on record. The Colonial Survey Cooperative has a classification library containing some 8,000 documented pre-collapse structural types, ranging from the commonplace, residential, civic, industrial, agricultural, to the rare and the ceremonial. The Vault of the Undivided did not match any of them. It was not entirely alien to the record either. Elements of it corresponded to construction techniques associated with pre-collapse maritime engineering. The use of compressed basalt aggregate in the outer shell, for instance, and the orientation of the load-bearing arches toward the prevailing current direction rather than the gravitational, vertical, which is a technique that appears in pre-collapse coastal structures built to withstand tidal stress. But the interior configuration, insofar as it could be read from the scan data, was unlike any maritime structure on record. It was more like a hall. A ceremonial hall to endure. It had endured. 10,000 years of tectonic activity, 1,100 years of submersion under 2,000 meters of cold, dark water, and the vault of the undivided was structurally intact, not undamaged. The outer shell showed stress fractures consistent with 11 centuries of pressure load, and the eastern wall had partially collapsed at some point in the first 2 centuries of submersion, which is why the vault's interior was fully flooded. But the primary chamber was sealed. The lock system on the primary chamber's 2 main access points, the survey team called them Gate North and Gate South, was operational. 11 years of survey teams had confirmed this. The lock system did not respond to any authorized override. It did not respond to any signal protocol in the cooperative's library. It did not respond to brute mechanical forcing. It simply held. 4 of the 11 teams had recommended permanent restricted access classification and discontinuation of survey operations at the site. The 4 had cited structural risk to survey personnel, meaning they felt the shelf's seismic activity made extended operations near vault potentially dangerous. The other 2 had cited something different. They had cited in their formal recommendations a term that is not a standard survey classification. The term was unresponsive to authorized presence, by which they meant that the lock system appeared to be functioning, appeared to be capable of response, and was simply declining. I had read all 11 survey reports before my descent. I had read them because that is what I do. I read the record. You do not go into a deep ocean survey site without reading every report that preceded you, and you do not read survey reports the way you read casual correspondence. You read them the way a surveyor reads a site, looking for what is present, what is absent, and what the people before you may have described accurately but interpreted incorrectly. What I noticed in all 11 reports was this. Every team had attempted Gate North, then Gate South, then returned to Gate North, then returned to Gate South. They had varied their signal protocols and their mechanical approaches, but they had all approached the same 2 access points. Not one of them had surveyed the full outer perimeter of the vault in detail, because not one of them had found any reason to. The vault's outer shell was rubble at the eastern end and solid base salt aggregate on the remaining 3 sides. There was no obvious 3rd access point. But the shelf moved, and in the 14 months prior to my descent, the shelf had moved. These seismic survey that triggered my assignment to HFY's shelf was a mapping follow-up after a sequence of micro-events on the southern fault. Low magnitude, no structural risk, but enough ground motion to require an updated bathymetric pass to confirm no significant changes to the survey. Site's physical profile. That was my assignment. Map the site. Confirm the vault's outer shell integrity had not been compromised by the micro-events. File the updated bathymetric record. I was not assigned to attempt entry. I was not assigned to survey the lock systems. I was assigned to go down, look at the outside, and come back up. The crack was on the western wall. It was not large, approximately 40 centimeters at its widest point, narrowing to perhaps 12 at the base, running diagonally across a span of roughly 3 meters. It was a fresh crack. It had not been there in the most recent prior survey imagery, which was 18 months old. The micro-events had opened it. The crack was large enough for a survey specialist in a standard deep pressure suit to pass through, moving carefully, on exhale. I noted it in my field log. I photographed it from 3 angles. I noted in the field log that it appeared to provide access to the vault interior and that I was going to assess entry feasibility. I did not request clearance from the cooperative's operations center because in deep ocean survey operations, real-time communication latency means field assessment decisions are made by the specialist on site. I had the authority to make the call. I made the call. The interior of the Vault of the Undivided, as I first encountered it, was dark. Not entirely dark. There was a residual bioluminescence in the walls, a pale green-blue phosphorescence that I initially assumed was marine biology, accumulated over 11 centuries of submersion. The served literature on deep ocean pre-collapse structures is full of instances of bioluminescent organisms colonizing submerged buildings, and the color and distribution were consistent with that explanation. I noted it in my suit recorder. I described it as probable bioluminescent colonization, distributed across approximately 40% of the western and northern wall surfaces, with higher constancy near the ceiling arches. I was wrong about what it was, but I did not know that yet. The chamber I had entered through the crack was not the primary chamber. It was what the structural survey data had labeled as the antechamber. A transitional space approximately 12 meters wide and perhaps 20 long, floor covered in a fine silt that my movement was already disturbing into slow billowing clouds. The ceiling was intact, the arches were intact. At the far end of the antechamber, directly ahead of me, was a door. Not a gate. Not a lock system like gates north and south, which the survey reports had described as massive sealed constructions of some composite material the materials analysts had never fully identified. This was a door in the older sense. Two panels of the same basalt aggregate composite as the outer walls, fitted precisely to the door frame, with no visible mechanism and no visible seam at the join. If you did not know it was a door, you would have described it as a wall. I knew it was a door because the survey data had shown it in the scan imagery. It was listed in the survey records as tertiary access point. Interior facing, no mechanism, no survey team had prioritized it because it appeared to be a sealed internal partition rather than an external lock system, and it had no history of any survey team attempting to open it because no survey team had gotten far enough inside to try. Put my hand on the join between the two panels. I was not trying to open it. I want to be precise about this. As in the review board's summary, the phrasing they used was, "Specialist Vayan applied pressure to the door panels," which implies intention. I did not apply pressure. I put my hand on the join the way you put your hand on a wall to steady yourself in low visibility. The silt disturbance had reduced my sight line to approximately 2 meters. I was orienting. The door opened. Not slowly, not with any grinding or mechanical resistance. It opened the way a door opens when the latch has already been released and you merely push. Smoothly, evenly, both panels swinging inward together on a movement. So frictionless, it seemed possible for a mechanism that had been sealed for 10,000 years under 2,000 meters of water. I stood in the doorway. I stood there for what my suit's time log later confirmed was 47 seconds. Then I went through. Primary chamber of the Vault of the Undivided is 62 meters long, 41 meters wide, 38 meters tall at the apex of its central vault. I know these measurements precisely because I spent the next 11 minutes after entering it, walking its perimeter with my suit's laser measure active, recording every dimension, because that is what a surveyor does when she enters an unknown space. You measure it. You document it. You do not stand in the middle of it with your mouth open, because your mouth is behind a faceplate, and there is no one to see the expression on your face, and the job does not get done by staring. I measured the chamber. I photographed the walls. I logged observations. The observations I was logging were as follows. The bioluminescent phosphorescence was not biology. I had concluded this by the time I reached the chamber's northern wall. Approximately 4 minutes into my perimeter survey, the distribution was too precise. Biology colonizes surfaces in patterns governed by nutrient flow, light gradients, current direction, surface chemistry. The phosphorescence on the walls of the primary chamber was distributed in lines, long, clean, continuous lines running from floor to ceiling in regular intervals and in shorter, more complex clusters that I initially took for patterns of some kind and which I later identified as inscription. The lines and the inscription covered approximately 70% of the wall surface. The floor was silt-covered, but the ceiling was clear, and the ceiling showed the same distribution. Lines and inscription, floor to ceiling, a complete envelope. It was not colonization. It was integral to the structure. The walls had been built this way. Whatever the phosphorescent material was, It had been embedded in the basalt aggregate composite at construction. 10,000 years later, it was still faintly active. I noted this. I kept walking. The second observation, the floor plan. The chamber was not a hall in the civic sense, not a space designed for assembly, gathering, for the movement of crowds. It was oriented. The entire geometry of the space was organized toward a single focal point at the chamber, southern end, where a raised platform, perhaps 3 meters above the chamber's floor, accessible by a flight of wide, low steps, supported the largest single structure in the room. I had seen it in the scan data. The scan data had labeled it. Elevated platform fixture, probable ceremonial, dimensions uncertain. The dimensions were not uncertain in person. The structure on the platform was a throne. It was 15 meters tall. From its base to the highest point of its back construction, rows were in a series of 3 sweeping vertical arcs that met at a single point above the center of the seat. The material of the throne was the same basalt aggregate composite as the walls, fused with something else. A second material threaded through it in veins, catching the phosphorescence and amplifying it, so that the throne in the chamber's faint ambient glow appeared to be lit from within, not brilliantly, dimly, a low, deep amber blue, like light seen through old water. I measured the throne from 4 angles. I photographed it from 8. I noted in my suit recorder that the fused secondary material appeared to be organic in origin. The vein structures were consistent in their branching geometry with biological material, specifically with the kind of slow calcified growth formation produced by certain deep water corals under long-term pressure conditions. If that identification was correct, the coral had been incorporated into the throne's construction at the time of building, and had continued to grow, slowly, in the 10,000 years since. It would explain the vein distribution. It would explain the amplification of the phosphorescence. I noted this, and kept moving. The third observation, which I made at the 7-minute mark of my perimeter survey, the light was changing. It was subtle. I might not have noticed it at all if I had not been moving in a steady, systematic pattern around the chamber's perimeter, which meant that every time I glanced back at the throne, it was from a slightly different angle, and the change in angle was revealing a change in the throne's glow. Not brighter exactly, more directional. The amber blue was still ambient, still distributed through the coral, veined material throughout the structure. But in the 8 minutes since I had entered the primary chamber, it had developed a directionality. It was leaning, if light can lean, toward the part of the room where I was. I stopped walking and looked at the throne for a full minute. The light was coming from the throne in all directions, but more of it was coming in my direction than in any other direction. That was what I was observing. I am a surveyor. I do not interpret what I observe before I have finished observing it. I noted what I was seeing, described it in plain language in my suit recorder, and resumed my perimeter survey. At the 9-minute mark, I reached the southern end of the chamber and the base of the platform steps. At the 10-minute mark, I was standing at the top of the steps, 2 meters from the throne. The light was very clearly oriented toward me now. Not a beam, not a focused projection. More like how heat moves toward the lowest temperature in a room. A tendency, a drift, a natural inclination. The coral veins in the throne's material were visibly more active than they had been when I entered the chamber. Not dramatically, not blindingly, but the glow that had been faint when I stood at the far northern end was now enough to read by if I had had anything to read. I thought, that moment, about gates north and south, about 11 survey teams and 6 years of refusals, about the review board summary that had used the phrase, unresponsive to authorized presence. I thought, the gates refused them. This did not. I reached out and put my gloved hand on the throne's nearest armrest. What happened next I will describe as precisely as I am able, because precision is the only honesty I have to offer. The throne did not vibrate. It did not shake. There was no sound that I heard with my ears. My suit's external microphones registered the ambient acoustic environment of the chamber, which is consistent deep water silence. The kind of silence that is not emptiness but pressure, 1,000 meters of ocean sitting on everything. I did not feel a jolt or a current. The phosphorescent glow in the throne did not suddenly blaze up. What happened was that the panels moved. The inscription panels on the southern wall, the wall directly behind the throne, separated from the wall. They did not fall. They did not slide. They rotated, each panel pivoting on a central axis I had not previously identified because the join between each panel and the wall had been seamless, opening to reveal the negative space behind them. Deep alcoves in the wall, each one containing a further surface of inscription, these ones in a different character set, smaller and denser than the inscription on the panels themselves. The panels opened one by one, in sequence from left to right over the course of perhaps 40 seconds. I counted 14 panels, 14 alcoves, interior inscription surfaces. I was still touching the throne. The direction of the light shifted fully. Every phosphorescent vein in every surface in the room, walls, ceiling, throne, oriented toward me with a completeness that left no ambiguity. The chamber's ambient glow disappeared. What remained was a directed illumination centered on the throne and on my hand on the throne's armrest and on me. I was standing in the brightest spot in the room, and the room had organized itself to make me the brightest spot. I let go of the armrest. The light did not change. It did not recenter or redistribute. It stayed on me. I took a step back from the throne. The light followed. I want to be clear that I was not afraid. I have thought about this many times in the months since, and I have wondered whether that absence of fear was professionalism, or trained field discipline, or the particular quality of stillness that comes from being 2,000 meters underwater in a sealed suit. Fear is a luxury the environment cannot accommodate. I do not know. What I know is that I was not afraid. I was intensely, specifically attentive, in the way I become attentive. When a survey site is something I have not yet understood, something was speaking in a language I had not identified, and I was listening. I walked to the nearest of the open alcove panels. The inscription in the alcove was dense, small characters in a close regular grid, covering the full surface of the alcove's interior wall, was perhaps 60 centimeters wide and 120 tall. I photographed it with my suit camera. Then I leaned closer to look at it. The character set was unfamiliar, or nearly unfamiliar. There was something in its structure, in the way the characters combined, in the logic of the spacing and the grouping, that was almost familiar. Not a language I had been taught, not a language I had studied, something else. Something closer to the way familiarity lives in the body rather than in the mind. The shape of a tool you have used so many times your hand knows it before your eyes confirm it. I had seen these shapes before, not these exact characters, but the underlying structure of them, the way they nested, the way the smaller forms modified the larger ones, the directionality of the reading sequence. My grandmother had used this structure. She had called it the notation. My grandmother's name was Pelka Vane. She died when I was 17, which means I knew her for all of my formative years. And what I knew about her was this. She had been a pressure systems engineer for the Eastern Shelf Desalination Cooperative, predecessor organization, to the current cooperative that I work for, which was founded in survey year 198 after the previous entity dissolved in a restructuring. Pelkey Vane had spent 40 years working on the buried pressure lock networks that regulate water flow through the submerged desalination infrastructure beneath HFY's reach and the neighboring shelf systems. She was, by every account I have ever heard, an exceptionally skilled engineer who never held a title higher than senior technician, despite work that her colleagues consistently described as foundational to the shelf infrastructure continued function. She had a notation system. I had grown up watching her use it. A set of shorthand marks she made when she was working through pressure flow calculations or mapping lock, sequence adjustments, fast compressed marks on whatever surface was nearest, not a formal notation, not something she had been taught, something she said she had inherited from her own mother, who had been a pressure systems engineer before her. A family shorthand. The marks meant something specific to anyone trained in it. Pressure differentials, flow rates, lock sequence timings, load tolerances. Engineering language, compressed into a form that fit in a margin. My mother had learned it. My mother had also been a pressure systems engineer for the Eastern Shelf infrastructure, until she retired 15 years ago. I had learned it too, informally, the way children learn the vocabulary of a parent's work. Not because anyone taught me systematically, but because I had grown up hearing, spoken, and seeing it written, and it had become part of the furniture of my understanding. I had used it occasionally in my own survey work, when I was working quickly, and needed shorthand notation for structural observations that I would expand into formal language later. My grandmother had never told me where the notation came from. She had said it came from her mother, and I assume her mother said the same, and the chain went back until whoever had said it first said something different, or said nothing at all. In the alcove of the Vault of the Undivided, 2,000 meters beneath the sea, I was looking at a wall covered in the notation, not a close version of it, not a structural analog or a historical precursor that shared some of its logic. The notation, the exact characters, in the exact combinatory grammar, in the exact reading sequence. My grandmother's shorthand, or rather, what I had always understood to be my grandmother's shorthand, was carved into the interior wall of a vault that had been sealed for 10,000 years. I took photographs of every alcove. I took them carefully and completely. The way you document something you do not yet understand, and may not understand for a long time. I took 437 photographs in the primary chamber of the Vault of the Undivided. I know this because my suit's camera system logged each capture. I was taking the last set of photographs, working along the alcoves in sequence, when I became aware that I could not leave. The door through which I had entered the primary chamber was closed. I had not heard it close. I had not seen it close. My suit's time log tells me that the door closed at the 23-minute mark of my time inside the primary chamber. I had been photographing the alcoves, fully absorbed, and the door had simply quietly closed. The door through which I had passed from the antechamber had been the only entry and exit I knew of. Gates north and south were in the antechamber itself, and even if I could reach them, 11 years of survey data had established that they did not open. I noted this in my suit recorder in plain language. Exit route closed, current status, unable to exit primary chamber, assessing. I want to be very clear that this is what I recorded, because the review board summary characterized my response at this point as calm, which is accurate in outcome but slightly wrong in characterization. I was not calm the way a person is calm when nothing is wrong. Calm the way a person is calm when they have identified that panic is not a useful tool and have set it aside in favor of assessment. I have been in situations in the field where the appropriate tool was something other than panic. I reached for the right tool. The right tool moment was to stop moving and listen. I stood in the center of the primary chamber, facing the throne, and I stood still. The light was still oriented toward me. The throne's coral-veined glow was steady and directional and unchanged. The alcoves were open. The inscription was visible on every surface. Nothing was moving, and then the throne spoke. I have said that the acoustic record on my suit sensor log captured a resonance signature and a 3-second anomaly that the cooperatives analysts classified as a structural settling event. This is true. The reason the throne's voice does not appear in any interpretable form in the acoustic record is that it was not, in any strict physical sense, a sound. It was a resonance. Traveled through the water in the chamber, and through the basalt composite walls, and through the floor beneath my boots, and through the suits. Material and into my body, and my body understood it, the way my body understands the notation. Not through a learned faculty, through something older and more structural than learning. A reflex, a recognition. What I felt, what my body registered, translated by whatever process my nervous system uses to convert resonance into language, was a sentence, 5 words. You are the tide's memory. Stood still for a long time after those 5 words. My suit's time log says 3 minutes and 44 seconds. I was not paralyzed. Thinking. What I was thinking about was my grandmother, Pelka Veen, senior technician, Eastern Shelf Desalination Cooperative, 40 years of service to the buried pressure lock networks beneath HFY's reach. Her notation, carved into the walls of a vault sealed 10,000 years ago. Her work, and her mother's work, and her mother's mother's work, and the work of the line of Vane engineers before them, going back further than I had any documented record of. The buried infrastructure they had, maintained and repaired, and kept functional across generations. Not because they had been ordered to. Not because they had been paid especially well for it. The Eastern Shelf infrastructure maintenance contracts were not lucrative. They had never been lucrative. They were the kind of steady, unglamorous work that organizations like the Cooperative assign to people who can be trusted to do it correctly without requiring supervision. The Veens had always been those people. I had always understood this as a simple story about a family of competent engineers in an unglamorous specialty. I was revising that understanding. The alcoves were full of inscription in the notation. The notation was not, I was understanding now, shorthand that my grandmother had invented or inherited, casually. It was the engineering language of the vault itself, the language in which the vault systems had been documented and recorded, the language in which the pressure lock networks and the desalination infrastructure beneath HFY's reach had originally been specified and built. Someone 10,000 years ago or near enough had built the infrastructure first and the vault second, or at the same time, or in some order that did not matter as much as the fact that they had built both, and they had built them in the same language. And that language had passed through my family's hands for as long as anyone could trace. The Tide's memory, not a title in the aristocratic sense, not king or queen or maker or heir of anything that implied a court, a bloodline, a throne room with politics and succession disputes, and all the human apparatus of inherited power. The Tide's memory was something else. It was the person who knew where the water went and how to make it go there. The person who knew the lock sequences, the pressure tolerances, the flow rates of the buried networks that the collapse had submerged but not destroyed. The networks that kept the shelf's remaining habitable surface supplied with clean water. The networks that the Eastern Shelf Desalination Cooperative maintained because they had always maintained them. Maintained them through the collapse, through the restructuring, through the Survey Cooperative's founding and expansion, through 11 centuries of submersion and tectonic movement, and the slow grinding of geological time. Maintained them because the Veins had always been the engineers who did this work. Maintained them because we had never stopped. The vault had not been waiting for a royal. It had not been waiting for a bloodline reveal in the sense of ancestry and entitlement. It had been waiting for the person whose hands knew the work, whose nervous system carried the notation as reflex, for whose family had continued the custodianship across 10,000 years, not because they knew they were custodians, but because they were, and the work was, and it needed doing, and they were the ones who knew how to do it. I was that person. I understood, standing in the light of the Tide throne, with the notation on the walls all around me, and my grandmother's shorthand suddenly making a different kind of sense, that I had always been that person, that every vein before me had been that person, that the knowledge had passed through us the way the notation passed. Not formally, not through any declaration or ceremony, but through the hands, through the work, through the unremarkable daily practice of understanding something in enough depth that it becomes part of you before you know to ask how it got there. The vault had sealed itself 10,000 years ago, and it had waited. It had waited while the water rose and the world changed and the collapse erased the memory of what had come before, until the memory lived only in the hands of the engineers who maintained what remained. It had waited through 11 years of survey teams, presenting their authorizations and their override protocols, and their official cooperative access, credentials. It had waited because none of them were the Tide's memory. They were authorized representatives of a legitimate organization with proper documentation and every right to be there, and the vault had no interest in any of that. The vault was not waiting for authorization. It was waiting for recognition, for the specific pattern of understanding that lived in a specific lineage of hands. Then, a crack opened in the western wall, and I came through it without asking permission, because it was a practical route, and I needed to map the site. The vault, apparently, found this entirely appropriate. The door opened again, 14 minutes after the throne spoke. I know the exact duration because I spent those 14 minutes sitting on the top step of the platform below the throne, taking very careful notes in my suit's voice recorder. Not notes about the vault, notes about the notation, specifically What I could read of the alcove inscriptions from where I was sitting, I was reading them as engineering documentation, because that is what they were. And I was reading them without difficulty. Should have surprised me more than it did. In the moment it felt less like a revelation than like a reminder. Like reading a document in your native language after someone told you it was untranslatable. The inscriptions in the alcoves were maintenance records, specification sheets, pressure lock calibration tables, flow rate parameters for the buried desalination network. They were detailed, precise, and in several places they described modifications to the infrastructure that I recognized specifically as modifications I knew had been made because my grandmother had described making them, and her mother before her passed down as the ordinary institutional knowledge of family engineering work. The vault's records and the Veen family's institutional knowledge matched. They had always matched. No one had known to compare them, because no one had been able to read the vault's records, and no one had thought to consider that an oral tradition of engineering modifications in a family of shelf infrastructure technicians might constitute a historical record worth academic attention. The door opened. I gathered my equipment, 3 final photographs of the primary chamber, and walked out. In the antechamber, I passed gates north and south on my way back to the crack in the western wall. I stopped at Gate North and looked at it for a moment. It was still sealed. The lock system showed no change. I thought about that for a moment. About what it meant that the interior door had opened for me and the exterior gates had not opened for anyone. About the difference between a lock that refuses all comers and a lock that is waiting for a specific one. Then I went through the crack and swam back up to Kirill. The ascent from 2,000 meters takes time. It is not a straight climb. You stage it, moving in intervals, giving your body time to equalize. I know the intervals by reflex. I have done them hundreds of times. The staging gives you time to think, and I thought, ascending through the dark layers of HFY's reach, with the data from 437 photographs and 3 hours of suit recorder, observations stored in Drive, about what I was going to do with what I had found. I thought about it practically, the way I approach field decisions. What were the facts? The Vault of the Undivided had opened for me, and not for 11 prior survey teams. Primary Chamber's throne had addressed me by a term, the Tide's memory, that I now understood as a designation of custodianship over the buried desalination and pressure lock infrastructure of HFY's reach. The Vault's records were written in a notation that my family had carried as engineering shorthand for as many generations as living memory ran. The infrastructure that notation described was the infrastructure the Veen family had maintained continuously for at least 7 documented generations of Eastern Shelf engineers, and likely longer. These were the facts. What were the implications? The implications were significant and they extended in directions I did not yet have the full architecture to map. The buried infrastructure of HFY's reach was not a footnote in the cooperative's operational picture. It was the reason the shelf's remaining habitable zones had remained habitable through the collapse and after it. The desalination networks, the pressureless systems, the flow regulators, buried under 2,000 meters of water. These were what made the difference between a shelf that could support human settlement and one that could not. The cooperative maintained them through contract. The contracts had always gone, reasons that no one had apparently examined closely, to engineering firms associated with the Veen family. Not exclusively, the cooperative's infrastructure maintenance operations were complex enough to require a range of contractors. But the core, pressure lock networks, the ones that the notation described in the alcoves of the vault, had always been Veen work, not because the Veens had lobbied for the contracts, because the Veens had always done the work, and done it well, and the cooperative had always renewed the contracts because there was no reason not to. The vault had not created this situation. The vault had recorded it. There was a difference. The designation of the Tide's memory was not a grant of power over the infrastructure. It was a recognition of the power that already existed. The power that lived in the hands and the knowledge and the quiet, continuous practice of the Engineers who had kept the water moving through the buried networks for longer than the collapse had existed. The throne had not given me anything. It had named what was already mine, and what had already been my family's, in a form we had simply never known to call by that name. I thought about my grandmother, about the way she moved around a pressure lock panel. Quick, economical. Not looking at her hands, because her hands knew the work without looking. About the notation she put in the margins of her technical sketches, fast and dense and illegible to anyone who had not grown up watching her. About the 40 years she had spent maintaining systems most people did not know existed, in the service of an organization that valued her competence without knowing what she was really doing. She had been the tide's memory. She had not known it by that name. It had made no difference. I had been the tide's memory for 31 years, without knowing it by that name. It had made no difference. The question now was whether the name changed anything. I surfaced at 0341 hours local time. The sea above Hiva's shelf was calm, the way it is calm in the early hours before the wind rises. A flat, dense calm with a low swell that rocked. Prok, Kirill. In a slow, regular rhythm as I ran my post-dive systems check, I had been underwater for just under 7 hours. My suit's power reserves were at 31%, which was within normal parameters for an extended solo dive. My photography and recording data was intact and backed up to Cherokee Kiral's drive. I sat in the cockpit of Kiral. 40 minutes before I filed anything, I was not deciding whether to report. I am a surveyor. I report what I observe. What I was doing in those 40 minutes was thinking about how to report it. What language to use, what level of detail to include, what the implications of different framings might be, and how to ensure that the record I filed was accurate without being speculative, specific without overstating what the physical evidence could actually support. The throne's voice was not on the acoustic record. I knew this already. I had checked the raw audio during the ascent staging and found only the resonance signature and the settling anomaly. What I had observed in the vault was on the visual record and on the suit recorder's voice log, where I had described everything I saw in real time. The opening of the door, the opening of the alcove panels, the orientation of the phosphorescent light, the inscription in the notation, 437 photographs. My reading of the alcove inscriptions during the 14 minutes I had spent on the platform steps. All of this was in the record. What was not in the record was the throne's voice. And what was not in the record was what I understood about the notation, about my family, about what the tide's memory meant, because I had not put those conclusions on the suit recorder. I had reached them in the staging silence of the ascent, in the unhurried dark between depth layers, and I had not spoken them aloud. The debrief report I filed at 0521 hours was accurate. I described the crack in the western wall and my entry through it. I described the antechamber and the interior door, and the door's opening. I described the primary chamber's dimensions and contents. I described the phosphorescent inscription, its distribution, the opening of the alcove panels, the notation. I described the doors closing and reopening. I described my observations accurately and in full. The report was 17 pages long, which is long for a post-dive debrief. Not unusual for a site, with the complexity of the vault of the undivided. At the end of the report, in the field labeled additional notes, I typed one line. Anomaly resolved, chamber occupied. Then I closed the report file and transmitted it to the cooperative's operations center and went to sleep. I have been asked many times, in the 14 months since, whether I intend to act on what I learned in the vault. Whether the designation of the tide's memory carries with it some obligation or some right that I plan to exercise. Whether the buried infrastructure of Hiva's reach is now in any meaningful sense mine. It is a reasonable question. I understand why people ask it. My answer is the same every time. The infrastructure of Hiva's reach was always the tide's memories to maintain. The Veens have maintained it. We have maintained it well. The water has moved through the buried networks for 11 centuries of collapse, and 900 years of reconstruction, and every generation of settlement since. And it has moved correctly, and the shelf's habitable zones have remained habitable, And the people who live in them have had clean water. And they have had it because the pressure locks were calibrated, and the flow rates were maintained, and the systems were kept in repair by people who knew how to do that work, and did it, without requiring anyone to know their name. My grandmother did not need to be called the tide's memory in order to be the tide's memory. She was. I do not need the vault's recognition to continue the work. The work does not require recognition. The work requires that someone who knows how to do it shows up and does it, and writes down what they did, teaches the notation to whoever comes next, and makes sure the water keeps moving. The vault's designation does not change the work. It does not change what the work is, or what it requires, or who is qualified to do it. It does not grant authority that was not already present. It does not create obligation that did not already exist. What it does, what I think about, when I think about what those 5 words in the resonance of the tide throne actually meant, not symbolically but functionally, is confirm the record. The vault was built as a record. It has been keeping the record for 10,000 years. The specifications, the calibration tables, the flow rate parameters, the maintenance history, encoded in the notation and in the correspondence between the vault's inscriptions and the Vane family's institutional knowledge, a correspondence that has been continuous and unbroken for as long as either record runs. The vault confirmed that the record was correct, that the custodianship had been maintained, that the line had held. It is a very old thing, the desire for someone to confirm that the record is correct, that the work you did, that the work your mother did, and her mother before her, that the quiet, unglamorous, necessary work of keeping the systems running, that it was seen. That somewhere in the structure of things, something knew and remembered and held the record against the day when it could be verified. The Tide Throne held that record for 10,000 years. My grandmother never knew. She did the work anyway. That is the kind of thing that stays with you. Crack. In the western wall of the Vault of the Undivided has been sealed by the Cooperative's structural team. The site is under restricted access classification. An academic consortium has been granted limited survey rights, pending a review process that is expected to take several years. The notation in the alcoves is being studied by a team of linguists and engineering, historians who have, as far as I know, not yet determined how to read it. I have been asked to consult. I have said I will think about it. True. Kirill is back in operation. I returned to field assignment 6 weeks after the HFY's Shelf incident, as the Cooperative's official communications continue to call it. My current assignment is a bathymetric survey of the northern shelf edge, which is a routine mapping project with no anomalies in the prior survey data and no expectation of unusual discoveries. It is the kind of assignment I do well. I have been doing it for 11 years. Yesterday, while I was working through the pressure distribution data from the buried lock network at the northern shelf's western approach, a routine check, the kind of thing that takes 20 minutes and requires no special attention, I caught myself making notation in the margin of my field log. Fast, pressed, the characters my grandmother used. I looked at what I had written. It was a flow rate calculation for lock sequence 7 north, to 4 significant figures. My hands had done it without asking my mind whether to start. I finished the calculation, closed the field log, and went back to work. The water was still moving, the systems were holding. Somewhere under 2,000 meters of cold, dark ocean, in a sealed chamber that had been waiting 10,000 years to say 5 words, the Tide Throne was keeping the record. My grandmother had been in that record, her mother before her, all the Veens before all of them, back to whoever had first learned the notation and first put their hands on the pressure locks of HFY's reach, and understood, in the wordless way that real knowledge lives in the body before it lives in the mind, what the work required and how to do it. I was in that record now too. I did not need to go back to the vault to know it. I already knew it. I had always known it. My hands had known it first.